So the first thing is to tell you a little bit more about where I come from and what we do. I represent cooperatives. Cooperatives are a group of citizens that are working together to deliver energy services. It's basically like traditional companies except for one thing. We have a very different way of looking at governance. We basically work on shared governance. So it's the principle of one member, one vote, meaning it's not the amount of money that you put into the structure, is actually if you're participating that is rewarded. We give you the same level of governance if you are participating and not how much money you put actually in the structure. So the important thing to know about the cooperative aspect is that we live and die by the trust of our members. The only value we have is if our members trust us to deliver the service correctly, to not get their data away and not waste it or not do something unethical. And by then, we are held to a higher standard. And that's okay. But the point is then we had to develop strategies to manage data specifically because we still want to deliver to our members the services that any companies around here are actually delivering. So the first thing to talk about is what is a cooperative? What is the base for this governance system? So I'm not talking here about the legal model of the cooperative. The legal model of the cooperative is happening in different countries and it's different everywhere. For example, here in France it's the SCIC, Société Coopérative d'Intérêt Collectif. But in Greece, for example, there is also a model of cooperative. In the Netherlands, there is also a model. In many countries around the world, there is a model of cooperative which is based on government legislation. However, when I talk about cooperative here, I'm talking about those 8 principles that are defined by the International Cooperative Board. The interesting thing about those 8 principles is that they define the cooperative model and the cooperative system, the system that we're trying to build together, and how we basically organize ourselves collectively. Those cooperatives are interesting because of 3 principles that I'm going to present to you today and that are touching on data specifically. 1, democratic ownership. What that means is basically that we have the control through times of all the assets of the cooperative. As a member, you own a part of that cooperative and therefore you own a part of the asset as well. That means what I told you before, the one member, one vote principle. The second point is autonomy and independence. Of course, as a cooperative, your job is to keep independence in order to continue serving your members. And finally, concern for the community. The number one thing that you want is to serve the community first. So therefore, there is an alternative motive to a cooperative. It's not a profit motive, like in a traditional company setting. There is one thing, however, that is not tackled here, which is training and education. And that's what I want to talk about regarding data. Training and education is the key to ensuring the knowledge and the participation of our member through data schemes. For those of you who are following a little bit the policy agenda in Europe, you probably recognize some of the principles that are built into the energy communities. So renewable energy communities and citizen energy communities that were published in the Clean Energy Package of the European Commission. The interesting thing is some of those principles are taken back and they are used to be creating collective organizations for citizens. The idea, of course, is not to bring organizations that are going to bring profit and therefore continue growing and go on the global scale, but rather to serve a very local purpose in order to deliver value at the local level. And that's exactly what the cooperatives are doing. So how is that interesting for data? Well, because it allows us to build trust. Trust is a weird thing. So the question that was asked before, would you trust an algorithm to make the right decision in a moral case, is quite interesting. Would you trust your neighbor to make that decision? Would you trust your energy supplier to make that decision? Would you trust the organization around you, your government, to make that decision for you? That's a big question. The whole point is the way we build trust of our members and the way we leverage their data more often than maybe traditional companies is linked to 3 things. 1 is governance. We actually provide rights to our consumers, to our members, directly on our governance structure. And therefore, if you're not happy with something, you can simply act on the governance. The second thing is transparency. The idea of a cooperative is to be as transparent as possible in order for everybody not to have surprises at the end. I think that happens to a lot of us, and I heard a lot of examples in the past regarding smart meter deployments. You put a smart meter in the house of a consumer, and then later on, you get complaints about the fact that you're using their data to do this and that. Of course, if you don't actually inform them about what's going on, they might get the wrong idea. So our goal is to bring as much transparency to the system as possible. And finally, the third point, and I already touched on it, is education and information. The big point here is to make sure that not only we are clear towards our members, but they also are able to understand. And that's the problematic of education. Of course, we cannot all be energy specialists, but we need to have a minimum understanding of the world around ourselves, and that is the role of the cooperative. That is why we build collective schemes, is because we build trust actors and we get information in return. So what I'm going to do today with you, and I'll try to hurry up because we don't have too much time, is to present you 3 examples of schemes that we put in place in order to illustrate those 3 principles: governance, transparency, and education. If at any point I'm not clear, stop me. Yeah? We're not too many in the room today, so we can actually do that. Fantastic. Okay, so the first example that I want for you guys is Energy ID. Energy ID is an energy efficiency tool that was built by the cooperative EcoPower from Flanders. And the idea of that tool basically is to support the member of the cooperative to save energy. It's a traditional energy efficiency tool. You count your consumption. They make a prediction over the next year based on your previous patterns. And then they help you through different recommendations to save energy. Switch off your lights, switch your appliances, make sure that you have different times of the day where you consume, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, there is nothing really innovative about that tool, except for one thing. One, in order to join that tool, you also need to join their governance model. So you need to be either a member of a cooperative that then has a seat in their board, or you need to buy a share of that cooperative. Why is it so important? Because once you join that cooperative, you actually have a right on the governance. And so then you feel engaged into participating in the governance model. You get to learn about what do we do with your data, specifically your consumption data. What can you do with that data, and where can we go together? And also, are you agreeing with the general idea of the tool? Maybe you don't agree with the fact that we're checking your data. Maybe you want to stop that model. What we saw is that a lot of the cooperative members actually decided to join that tool in Belgium. And the reason for that was because it's not enough to consume green electricity, but the idea was also to reduce your consumption in order to push the transition. So we had a big success with that tool. But then what we did through a project called REScoop.eu, which looked at energy efficiency in cooperatives specifically, was to try to build a consent form, or let's say a data privacy process that was going a little bit further than that. That data privacy process was based, of course, on the publication of the new GDPR, and it was around 3 main themes. One, anonymization. So that's the usual thing. Basically, everybody does that today. Maybe data minimization, so avoiding that we take too much data from our consumers, from our members. Making sure that our database are sanitary, and making sure that we also anonymize it, but that's the usual thing. The frame-by-frame consent. That means you give your consent for certain pieces of the service, and it's not because you don't give your consent to everything that suddenly you cannot access the service at all. You can access certain pieces of the service based on what you need and what you want, and so you give your consent for the processing of the data in that specific aspect. And finally, training and information. That's always the same model. If we want our members to understand what we're doing, we also need to educate them. We also need to take time and have discussions around what exactly are we doing together collectively. Now, that's not very innovative. So some of you will probably tell me, well, that's great, but I mean, then the future is flexibility. The future is what are we going to do to make the energy system more flexible and more renewable. And energy efficiency is great, but it's not very sexy. So that's why we decided to work on FlexScope. FlexScope is the construction of a cooperative aggregator. The idea is to build a platform where cooperative can aggregate the flexibility of their members in order then to make it available to the market. The idea behind it, of course, was not that complex in terms of the technical aspect, although it took us a long time to actually put the tools in place. But more importantly, what was interesting was, how do we keep the trust through time? A lot of our members don't understand actually the flexibility market, and also the fact is, once you put your services on the market, then somehow we had to give signals and we had to make people understand what was going on. So in that sense, the FlexCo platform is built in two ways. One, you have to be a member of the cooperative to provide your flexibility, and therefore your security is guaranteed by the fact that the cooperative is guaranteeing your interests. Two, the only people that can come into the platform need to be validated by the Council of Cooperatives. So the platform itself is owned by the cooperative. In that sense, we can avoid that there are bad actors coming into the platform, and we can guarantee to our members that they can trust everybody on it. So now the third point. We saw not innovative services, we saw innovative services. But now you will tell me, well, that's great, but not everybody's working for a cooperative here. It's not a cooperative event. I get that. So if I'm working for an energy company or for a municipality or for a government, how do I do that exactly? I cannot suddenly decide that I'm going to throw all my shareholders out and bring cooperative members in instead. That would be ridiculous. So that's why we try to build a different model with Compile. Compile is a project that looks at the full system. So it's a microgrid tool, a microgrid monitor that will help actually do the balancing inside a microgrid. It's a building monitoring tool. It's an EV tool. It's also a community cockpit that allows community to actually check their consumption through time and also provide their flexibility. So it's really the full model. However, it stays at the local level, and it is managed by cooperatives and other community actors. That's where I want to stop briefly and talk about the energy community definition that was brought in the Clean Energy Package. The idea behind it is not to say that you have to be 100% citizens to participate. On the contrary, like the definition that the European government brought to us is saying, we're talking about citizens, we're talking about municipalities, we're talking about SMEs. So we're talking about local actors. It's not that large companies don't have value. It's simply that if you want to have a discussion, there is a limit to the number of people you can have a discussion with. If you want to make sure that you engage the member truly and you do educational and training, you need to have a limited space to do so. You need to have a limited number of members to do so. That's what community building is. So Compile is looking specifically at that. How do we build communities? How do we build trust actors that will then allow citizens, one, to feel safe in the system that we're building, two, that will provide clear messages to the other members of the energy system, so you guys can do your job in peace and actually to the best of your abilities. For that, what we did was work with a large supplier in Slovenia, in the city of Luce, where we work with Petrol. We work with a municipality in Križevci in Croatia. And then we work with traditional cooperative actors, specifically around collective self-consumption. For all of them, we are following the same process. The first thing to do is to go and see the community first. So as actors, we are helping them go into their community and understand what are the needs of the citizens. Of course, like most of you know, if you are an energy company, you have kind of a clue of what needs to happen, especially if you want to integrate a lot of renewables. So the point is really to guide them through that process and make sure that we can create an understanding on what's going to happen to their local system. Based on that, we create community groups, so that's groups of citizens that will take on a piece of that process, that will try to understand and also be change drivers to their own communities. Through that process, what we do is create energy communities, so renewable energy communities mostly because we're talking about local areas. Those are legal forms. They can actually provide services, they can be business actors, they can be in a B2B relationship with the other actors of the energy system. And so that helps not only create the trust to the local citizens because they have somebody they can talk to, but also that creates the trust with the other actors, maybe DSOs, maybe suppliers, maybe large producers that also needs to provide the rest of the energy to the local cell. The idea really is to say, the energy community and to a certain extent the energy cooperative is a forum for transition. It's a place of discussion where we can all try to decide what kind of project we want to be on together. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'll be right there.
Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, so I heard that you talked about data privacy in your presentation, and that's a matter that concerns most, if not all of us. However, it's also a matter that costs a lot of money to the government, to the people, to the utilities. How do you think, what is REScoop's, let's say, proposal on transforming this cost into value?
Right. So, number one, for us, data privacy is not a cost. It's an opportunity. The reason why it's an opportunity is because it allows us to have a discussion with our members. So, the problematic of data privacy is not really that you try to protect data. Of course, we know that cyber attacks are everywhere, and we need to be aware of data sets where they're going to track data through time. We do that like most people here. That's not really a question, it's actually regulated. But the main value is coming out of the fact that once you have a discussion with people about what their data is doing and what kind of value we can get collectively out of it, then suddenly the discussion starts on, okay, so what is the collective project that we want? It's not about me investing euros directly. I already have great value. I have my consumption profile. I have my flexibility. I have a lot of things. I have basically my want in terms of what I want to do in my community. So that value is extracted by the data privacy topic simply because it's an easy topic to start with. Granted, it's not to make people panic, and it's a difficult discussion to have simply because people feel a little bit hurt by, where's my data going? But the reality is that once you create those trust actors, and that's the role also of the energy communities and the energy cooperatives, once you create those trust actors, they are here to have that discussion. They are here to say, well, we are in the same boat, we are in the same team.
Okay.